Here is a figure most people accept without question. The Industrial Iron Age, as taught in standard historical timelines, begins its serious infrastructure expansion somewhere between the 1820s and 1850s. Cast iron bridges, iron-framed buildings, iron rail lines. These emerge as products of the Industrial Revolution, which itself is dated fairly consistently to the latter half of the 18th century. The explanation is clean. Coal fuels furnaces. Furnaces produce iron at scale. Iron transforms cities. It makes intuitive sense, until you start measuring. Not measuring in a general way. Measuring specifically at the structures themselves, at the column diameters, at the load tolerances built into iron frameworks that were supposedly constructed for populations a fraction of the size that would eventually use them, at the rail gauges that were standardized, globally, across continents that had no reliable communication with each other, within a window too narrow to explain by coincidence and too wide to explain by conspiracy. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions, but those questions are worth sitting with. The standard model says iron infrastructure followed demand. Cities grew, populations expanded, trade volumes increased, and iron systems were built to meet the pressure. That is the sequence we are taught. Demand then infrastructure. Need then supply. Problem then solution. It is a logical model. Economies generally do work this way, except when they don't. Consider the rail network. Britain's first passenger railway opened in 1825. Within 25 years, Britain had laid over 6,000 miles of track. The accepted explanation attributes this to speculative investment fever, the railway mania of the 1840s, where capital poured into rail projects faster than reason could moderate it. Overbuilding happened. Companies collapsed. Some lines ran nearly empty for years. That part of the story is well documented. What is less discussed is the structural specification beneath those lines. The iron used, the weight tolerances engineered into bridges and viaducts, the load-bearing calculations embedded in the supporting frameworks. These were not built for the locomotives of the 1840s. They were not even built for the locomotives of the 1860s. A number of civil engineers working in the Victorian period noted, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with admiration, that the infrastructure they were inheriting from the previous generation was overbuilt by a factor they found difficult to justify given the equipment of the time. One word they used repeatedly was anticipatory. Not a suspicious word. Not a loaded word. Just an interesting one. The infrastructure, in their assessment, appeared to anticipate loads and demands that had not yet arrived. This pattern, infrastructure that precedes the demand it would logically require, appears in more than one context. That is what makes it worth examining carefully. Iron-framed market halls begin appearing in European cities through the 1820s and 1830s. Their scale is frequently noted by historians as ambitious. But ambition in architecture is not unusual. What becomes harder to explain with ambition alone is the consistency of the scale. Not just in London. Not just in Paris. In Ghent. In Leipzig. In cities whose populations at the time of construction were, by census data, quite modest. The halls were built for crowds they would not see for another generation, sometimes two. The argument made is usually the same. Civic pride, forward-thinking planning, wealthy patrons with grand visions. These are valid explanations. They deserve to be taken seriously. But they become strained when you begin accounting for the technical complexity involved. Iron-framed construction in this period was not simple or cheap. The engineering knowledge required to safely span the distances these halls were spanning was not trivially held. It had to come from somewhere. It had to be developed, tested, transferred. And yet it appears, across disconnected cities, across national borders, in places with no obvious shared technical lineage, at roughly the same time. Roughly. That word carries weight here. Because roughly, in historical terms, can mean 50 years. And 50 years is enough time for ideas to travel, for engineers to migrate, for technical manuals to circulate. No anomaly there. But in some cases, roughly means less than a decade. In some cases, the interval between a construction technique appearing in one city and appearing in a city with which it had no documented professional contact is short enough that the transfer itself becomes the question worth asking. Not was something transferred, but how? Official records in this period are not always complete. This is not controversial. Archivists, historians, and records managers acknowledge openly that 19th-century municipal documentation is uneven, often incomplete, sometimes entirely absent for specific decades. The reasons range from fires to floods to administrative neglect to intentional pruning of records deemed no longer relevant. None of these explanations are alarming on their own, but they do create gaps. And when you try to trace the technical lineage of certain iron construction methods, to find the firm, the engineer, the training institution, the published manual that would explain how a particular approach to column loading or arch-to-beam rationing arrived in a specific city, you sometimes find the documentation does not go as deep as you would expect. Not a gap that proves anything. A gap that simply sits there. Some researchers who work in architectural history have noted this problem in passing. The standard terminology is diffusion of knowledge, the idea that technical innovations spread through informal networks, through journeymen and traveling craftsmen and self-taught builders, in ways that leave lighter documentary traces than formal institutional transfer. This is absolutely how historical knowledge moved. The argument is sound. What it does not fully account for is the scale of what was being built in places where those informal networks would have had to be remarkably robust to do the work the theory assigns them. A traveling craftsman can carry a technique. He cannot carry the metallurgical knowledge required to specify iron of a particular grade for a particular tensile application. That knowledge requires infrastructure of its own, educational infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, testing infrastructure. And sometimes, that infrastructure appears to have arrived after the buildings it should have produced. That is not a claim. That is a sequence. A sequence that the official timeline, applied carefully and without prejudice, has some difficulty explaining cleanly. The question is not whether the buildings exist. They do. You can measure them. You can stand inside them. The question is how clearly we can trace the path from the knowledge required to build them to the moment they were built. In some cases, that path is well documented. In others, it narrows. In a few, it disappears before you expect it to. Britain is a convenient place to begin because its records are among the most thoroughly studied. Historians have spent nearly 2 centuries cataloging its industrial development, its engineering lineage, its institutional knowledge transfer. If the pattern of over-prepared iron infrastructure were isolated to 1 or 2 British examples, the explanation would be straightforward. Exceptional engineers, exceptional patrons, exceptional ambition. Case closed. But the British examples are not isolated. And when you cross the Atlantic, the pattern does not weaken. It compounds. The United States in the 1840s was not an industrially mature nation. Its population was concentrated along the eastern seaboard. Its interior was, by any honest measure, underdeveloped. Roads were inconsistent. Communication was slow. The institutional infrastructure required to produce a generation of trained civil engineers capable of executing large-scale iron construction did not, by the standard account, yet exist at the scale the coming decades would demand. And yet, the rail expansion that followed in the 1850s and 1860s did not proceed tentatively. It proceeded with a specification consistency that engineers of the period found difficult to attribute entirely to improvisation. Bridges built in this window, iron bridges over rivers in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and upstate New York, were engineered to tolerances that the locomotive technology of the time did not require and that the freight volumes of the time did not justify. The argument applied here is the same one applied in Britain. Investors and planners were thinking ahead. They were building for the future they anticipated. This is possible. Planners do think ahead. But thinking ahead in iron costs money that is difficult to raise for loads that don't yet exist. And the investors funding these projects were not, for the most part, sentimental dreamers. They were people who expected returns. Over-engineering a bridge for a load that wouldn't arrive for 30 years is not a decision a return-minded investor makes lightly. It requires either unusual foresight or unusual information. The records on which type of foresight it was are, in several notable cases incomplete. Move now to the structures themselves, and a different kind of consistency emerges. Across the northeastern United States, a series of iron-frame train stations and depot halls were constructed through the 1850s. Their designs, particularly the interior column arrangements and the roof span ratios, share a structural logic that historians of architecture have occasionally described as strikingly coherent for a period when communication between design offices was slow and standardization was informal. One interpretation is that a small number of influential pattern books circulated widely enough to produce this coherence. This is a credible explanation. Pattern books existed. They were used. What is harder to map is the gap between what pattern books typically transferred, visual language, proportional aesthetics, decorative grammar, and what appears to have been transferred in these cases, which was structural engineering logic. The kind of knowledge embedded in a column-to-span ratio is not aesthetic. It is load-bearing. It is the product of testing and failure and revision over time. That kind of knowledge, transferred informally, leaves traces. Engineers talk to each other. Firms correspond. Failures get written up. In some of the cases worth examining, the traces are thinner than the knowledge they should have produced. Written again briefly but through a different lens. The cast iron market structures that begin appearing in English cities from the late 1820s onward are frequently credited to a loose network of foundries concentrated in the English Midlands and, to a lesser extent, Scotland. The Coalbrookdale Works, the Butterley Company, a handful of others. These foundries are real. Their output is documented. Their contribution to British iron construction is not in question. What is occasionally noted in more specialized architectural literature is that certain structures credited to this network contain fabrication signatures, joint configurations, casting dimensions, surface treatment patterns that do not match the output profiles of any documented British foundry of the period. This is a technical observation, not a dramatic one. Fabrication attribution in 19th century iron is genuinely difficult. Records are incomplete. Foundries subcontracted. Components traveled. No serious historian treats a fabrication mismatch as automatically significant. But when mismatches cluster, when they appear not in one structure but in several, not in one city but across multiple, they become worth noting. Not as evidence of anything. As a pattern that sits unresolved in the literature. And the literature, for the most part, moves past these mismatches without extended examination. The United States offers one more example worth sitting with. Several American cities, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, St. Louis, developed cast iron commercial districts in the 1850s and 1860s. The Soho district of New York is the most famous surviving example, but it was not isolated. These districts replaced masonry facades with prefabricated iron fronts, often ordered from catalogs, assembled on site with a speed that contemporaries found remarkable. The speed itself is documented and explained. Prefabrication allowed rapid assembly. This is accurate. Less frequently discussed is the production capacity required to supply these districts simultaneously. The iron had to be cast, transported, and installed across multiple cities in overlapping time frames. The foundry network that made this possible was, according to the standard account, built up progressively through the 1840s in response to growing demand. But when you map foundry establishment dates against construction start dates in several of these districts, the sequence is tighter than comfortable. Not impossible. Not even improbable within normal margins. Just tight enough that the supply chain, charted carefully, requires a production ramp-up that the documented investment timelines do not fully explain. The iron was there. The question is where the preparation to produce it at that volume came from, and when that preparation actually began. Researchers who study this period from outside the mainstream architectural history tradition have noted these convergences, the scale, the timing, the cross-regional consistency, and begun organizing them under a broader analytical frame. That frame is not universally accepted. It is contested. Some historians treat it as a category error. Others treat it as a useful heuristic for grouping anomalies that conventional frameworks have difficulty accommodating individually. The label attached to this frame, the word used to group these observations, has in recent years circulated far beyond academic discussion. What that label means, what it is actually describing, and how seriously its underlying observations deserve to be taken is a question the next part of this examination cannot avoid. The word is Tartaria. It appears in comment sections, in independent research forums, in documentary thumbnails, in threads where people share photographs of ornate 19th century train stations and ask why a frontier town would have needed a building that grand. It appears with varying levels of seriousness, varying levels of sophistication, and, importantly, varying definitions. Because the word does not mean one thing. It never has. Before examining what it has come to mean in contemporary alternative history discussions, it is worth noting what it meant historically, because the historical usage is itself part of why the modern usage is so difficult to evaluate cleanly. Tartaria, or Tartary, was a geographic label used extensively in European cartography and political writing from roughly the 13th through the 18th centuries. It referred, with considerable imprecision, to the vast interior of the Eurasian continent, the steppe regions, the lands east of the Ural Mountains, territories that European cartographers knew existed but had not systematically mapped. It appeared on major atlases. It was not a fringe term. It was a working geographical designation used by serious scholars and administrators who simply needed a word for a large, not yet fully documented region. That is the historical baseline. Contested in its own time, imprecise by design, but real in the sense that it was used, printed, and referenced by people doing legitimate intellectual work. What happened to that label between its gradual retirement from cartographic use in the late 18th century and its reappearance in Internet-era alternative history discussions is a story about how unanswered questions accumulate. The modern usage of Tartaria as an interpretive frame, not a civilization claim, not an empire theory but a frame, groups together the kinds of observations examined in the preceding sections of this documentary. The overspecified infrastructure, the timing anomalies, the cross-regional consistencies in iron construction that are difficult to fully explain through documented knowledge transfer, the gaps in foundry records, the buildings that seem to have arrived slightly ahead of the population and industrial capacity that should have produced them. One interpretation, which several independent researchers and a smaller number of formally trained historians have articulated in various forms, is that 19th century infrastructure development was not built entirely from scratch in the manner that the standard progressive narrative implies. That some proportion of what the 19th century built was built on top of, or around, infrastructure and knowledge systems whose origins are not fully visible in the surviving documentary record. This is not a claim that a hidden empire existed. It is not a claim that anything was deliberately erased. It is, at its most careful, an observation about documentary continuity, specifically, about the places where that continuity is thinner than the physical evidence around it would suggest it should be. Some researchers who work within this frame are cautious and methodical. They point to specific structures, specific date discrepancies, specific fabrication anomalies, and argue that the cumulative weight of these specifics suggests a history of built infrastructure that is not fully captured in the institutional records we have inherited. Their work is not peer-reviewed in mainstream journals. It is not endorsed by university architecture departments. But it is not, at its most rigorous, intellectually dismissible on its face. Other voices working under the same label are less careful. They make claims that outpace their evidence. They treat documentary gaps as proof of concealment. They assign intentionality to what could be explained by archival entropy, the ordinary, undramatic loss of records that happens across every culture over time. These voices are louder, and they are the reason the label carries the skepticism it does in mainstream academic discussion. The difficulty is that the label covers both. And evaluating the underlying observations requires separating them from the interpretive conclusions that have attached to those observations, conclusions that range from the measured to the extraordinary. There is a specific class of structure that the Tartaria frame returns to repeatedly, and it is worth examining why. The large iron-framed public buildings of the mid-19th century, the train stations, the market halls, the exhibition palaces, are not just architecturally significant. They are symbolically significant to this discussion because of what they represent in the standard historical narrative. They are supposed to be triumph markers. Evidence that industrial civilization, having developed the knowledge and capacity to produce iron at scale, then chose to express that achievement in monumental public form. The interpretive question the Tartaria frame raises is not whether the buildings are impressive. It is whether the timeline of their impression runs in the direction we assume. Did industrial capacity produce monumental iron architecture? Or is it possible, in some cases, that the monumental iron architecture preceded, or at minimum coincided with, the industrial capacity we credit with its production? And if the sequence is less clean than the standard model implies, what does that suggest about the knowledge systems that were operating at the beginning of the 19th century? These are not answerable questions given the current state of the documentary record. That is the honest position. They are questions that sit at the edge of what the surviving evidence can resolve. Mainstream historians have several responses to this class of question, and they deserve to be represented fairly. The first is that documentary gaps are normal, not suspicious. Fires destroyed municipal records across Europe and America throughout the 19th century. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 alone eliminated decades of administrative documentation. Similar losses occurred in London, in Paris, in dozens of smaller cities. The absence of a complete paper trail for a construction project does not mean the project had an unusual origin. It means the records did not survive. This is the default condition of historical evidence, not an exception. The second response is that the over-engineering interpretation requires a benchmark that is itself not well established. Deciding that a bridge was built beyond the requirements of its time requires knowing, with precision, what the engineering standard of its time actually was. And that standard, in the mid-19th century, was neither uniform nor well documented. Engineers built with margins. They built conservatively. What reads as anticipatory specification may simply be competent, cautious practice. The third response is that the cross-regional consistency in iron construction is better explained by the mobility of skilled workers than by any anomalous knowledge source. Engineers and iron workers moved. They relocated for work. They brought methods with them. The network was informal but functional, and informal networks leave lighter documentary traces than formal ones by definition. These are serious responses. They hold weight. And yet the buildings remain. The spans remain. The load tolerances remain. The fabrication signatures that do not match the documented foundries remain. The tight supply chain timelines remain. Not as proof. Not as exposure of anything. Simply as physical facts that the documentary record, as currently assembled, does not fully surround. The label Tartaria, whatever its limitations, is in some sense a placeholder for that remainder, for the portion of the physical evidence that the standard timeline has not yet fully absorbed. Whether that remainder reflects a gap in the documentation, a gap in our analytical methods, or something more structurally significant about what the 19th century actually inherited from the centuries before, it is a question that serious architectural and industrial historians continue quietly to work around. Not through. Around. Which may itself be the most precise thing that can be said about where this examination ends. The structures were built. The knowledge that built them came from somewhere. And the line connecting those two facts, drawn carefully through the surviving record, is shorter than the distance between them.